My name is Kevin Muehlman. I am with the John Bradmus Center of New York University. This event is part of the Young Leaders Network and is in partnership with the Archer Center at the University of Texas System in Washington, D.C. Formed in 2014, the Young Leaders Network aims to promote in the next generation the spirit of public service as embodied for decades on Capitol Hill by John Bradmus. The Bradmus Center seeks to create programs that enrich the student experience while interning in Washington, D.C. Students who participate in this programming build a network of peers while they begin laying the groundwork for a career in public service. This event would not have been possible without the support of the Archer Center. I'd like to especially thank Michelle Chen, who serves as the center's academic director. Michelle teaches the undergraduate policy making class, and previously she was senior researcher and policy analyst at the Learning Policy Institute. Michelle is also a former congressional staffer working for more than 8 years as an education policy advisor for U.S. Senator John Cornyn of Texas, and for 4 years as a policy advisor for U.S. Representative Joe Barton of Texas. Please help me in welcoming Michelle Chen.
Thank you, Kevin. The Archer Center is pleased to join with the Bradmus Center at NYU and to host our second joint class and Young Leaders Network event. We're delighted today to welcome students from Baylor's DC firm. If you're from Baylor, great, welcome. And any NYU students? Great, we're happy that you're here. Thanks for hosting us. And then the Archer Fellows. So Archer Fellows, you kind of raise your hand. Great. So tonight's class is being live streamed. We're delighted to welcome Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey, who was elected to the Senate in 2013. Senator Markey served in the House of Representatives from 1976 to 2013, where he was the chair and ranking member of the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Telecommunications. We also welcome the Honorable Jack Fields, who served in the House of Representatives representing Texas's 8th Congressional District from 1981 to 1997. Mr. Fields also served as chair and ranking member of the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Telecommunications. Together, Mr. Fields and Senator Markey have made telecom history, and tonight we're here to learn more about the process and the lessons they've learned from legislating together. Our moderator is Nancy Scola, senior technology reporter at Politico. Before we begin, I've asked the UT System Vice Chancellor for Federal Relations and an Archer Center graduate professor, Mr. Bill Shute, to provide some historical context to the discussion. Before joining the UT System, Vice Chancellor Shute worked as a telecom lobbyist representing Southwestern Bell, and that's where I first met him when I was a junior telecom staffer working for Congressman Joe Barton. So these are all the ties that bind, and we're in for a great evening. So the way this will proceed, we will have the introduction from Vice Chancellor Shute. The discussion will be moderated by Nancy Scola, and then there will be a time for audience Q&A. We'll have microphones for the audience to ask questions of our panelists. So join me in welcoming our guests. And
well, thank you very much, Michelle, and welcome. It's my pleasure to get to kick off tonight's Legislating in the Art of Compromise discussion, focusing on the Telecommunications Act of '96. And in the 5 minutes that I've been allotted, that does not nearly do enough justice to the enormity of the '96 Act, or explore whether our guest speakers tonight's visions of it have been met. We'll let them talk about that. Instead, let me give you a little bit of context about the policy creations that led us to such an historic moment in 1996. So the early decades of the 20th century brought us a succession of policy debates and actions and regulatory oversight of the medium of the day, radio. Congress's first attempt to wrap its hands around this enormous new technology was the Radio Act of 1912, which said all radio stations should be licensed by the federal government and gave those powers to the Secretary of Commerce and Labor, future President Herbert Hoover, but that was severely limited by the courts. In fact, he could not even deny a license to anyone who wanted one. A decade later, the Radio Act of 1927 establishes a 5-person radio commission, the Federal Radio Commission. This becomes a model for where we are today. In fact, the language in that act is the key framing phrase that still holds true today, that those licenses should be granted and regulated as the public interest, convenience, or necessity required. And by the way, the 27 Act, introduced or proposed December 21st, 1926, passed by the House and Senate the same day in January 28th, and signed by the President on February 23rd. Can you imagine the brevity of that situation? Almost 1 year later, the first TV license is granted right here in DC to something called the Charles Jenkins Laboratory, even though amateur radio licensees were broadcasting TV signals at the time. Fast forward to 1933, and FDR reaches out to his Secretary of Commerce and says, we should do more. Let's put a panel together, figure out how we can get our grasp around this new technology. And he forms an interdepartmental committee which suggests that all communication services should be regulated by a single body. On February 26, 1934, FDR sends a message to Congress with this proposal in mind. And Senator Clarence Dill of Washington State and Texas's own Sam Rayburn introduce a bill the very next day. And it only takes until June before FDR signs the Communications Act of 1934, the bellwether policy from the federal government in terms of communications for literally decades. Now, the second half of the last century brings an explosion of technologies. Television overcomes radio as a medium of choice. Local stations and the big 3 networks dominate the media message that American consumers have at their disposal, until an upstart band of cable companies, networks, satellite transmissions in the 70s and 80s start to take over and move America from broadcasting to what we now know as narrowcasting. Now, on the telephone side, AT&T was the only game in town. Ma Bell controlled both local and long-distance telephone service, offered consumers a variety of options, as long as those options were black, rotary dial, and anchored to one specific place, in the home or the office. In fact, this service was so boring, it became known as POTS, plain old telephone service. Now, a few mavericks started to enter the scene in the 60s and 70s. People like John McCone and Bill McGowan created a company called Microwave Communications, Inc., or what you might have heard of as MCI, and started to challenge AT&T's monopoly over telephone service in very limited circumstances. But this prompted significant FCC rulings and court challenges that started to nip at the heels of Ma Bell. And in 1982, a case presided over by Judge Harold Green here at the Court of Appeals in the district resulted in a consent decree between AT&T and the Federal Trade Commission, known as the Modified Final Judgment. And what was significant about the MFJ is that it forced AT&T to cast off the regional local service, or the regional Bell operating companies. And it also allowed AT&T into the computer industry, from which it had been barred since inception. With the exception of the narrowly focused Cable Communications Act in 1984, Congress, by and large, had been absent from these policy discussions for decades, until a handful of members, led by our 2 guests tonight, spent nearly a decade trying to create a new policy framework for the soon-to-be new century. And like every other enormous policy endeavor or policy suggestion throughout the modern history of the Congress, public interest advocates and commercial entities actively engaged that debate, resulting in an explosion of lobbying activities and expenditures. For instance, according to Lee Drutman in his seminal work, The Business of America is Lobbying, he says from 1988 to 1998, telecommunications industry lobbying increased more than sixfold, with more lobbyists and expenditures in town than any other industry sector, including pharmaceuticals, banking, defense. In fact, during Congress's multi-year consideration of the drafts which eventually became the Telecommunications Act in '96, there were more registered telecommunications lobbyists than automobile, petroleum, and utilities lobbyists combined. Now, this is where I'm obligated to say, hi, my name's Bill. I'm a reformed telecommunications lobbyist. But tonight, we have the unique opportunity to hear from the two pioneers in this debate and gain some insight into how they navigated this complex policy creation after 6 decades of congressional avoidance. And perhaps we'll hear from them whether or not they think that the act has stood up to the test of time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. It's a beautiful night out there tonight, so it might have been a little bit harder to come in and talk about telecom policy. But I know the main attraction here is the two terrific members of Congress, and former member of Congress and current senator, that are here to talk about the Telecom Act. As Bill mentioned, these two folks are really just at the center of crafting that act pretty much with their bare hands. When we eventually got to a signing ceremony, a big high-profile signing ceremony at the Library of Congress, then Vice President Al Gore thanked a whole bunch of members. Everyone knew that really you two were the ones that should have gotten top billing at that. So we have this is just a terrific lineup to sort of talk about this tonight. So Senator Markey, if we can start with you. When people talk about the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the people that are sort of in the know about that say you can't start in 1996. You have to at least go back. Bill mentioned it goes back many years, but go back to 1994 and the work that the two of you did together on telecom policy back then. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, in particular, how you and the congressman started working together?
So by the time we reached 1993, I've been the chairman of the telecommunications subcommittee for 7 years. And I've already had like 50 hearings on this, going back to 1987, 86. So we've explored all the issues, but Judge Green in 1982 has broken up the telephone company into 7 little companies, including NYNEX, and Bell South, companies whose names, were now famous because they were still all in the top 50 biggest companies in the United States. And the Bell companies wanted legislation to pass that allowed for a mother and child reunion. Let's put them all back together again. And I'm chairman. I'm not going to allow that to happen. So we have hearings in 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92. Then Jack shows up as the new lead Democrat on Republican, Democrat, and we have a shared view on this. Meanwhile, the cable industry, which had been like city and town after city and town, individual owners all across the country after the 1984 Cable Act, it's now more universally deployed cable, which it hadn't been in '84, and the companies are now larger, and it's Time Warner, it's Comcast, it's still 7 or 8 big companies, but now the issue is this: we're pretty much still analog, we're still pretty much dial-up, we're still pretty much living in the old world, notwithstanding all the changes that had taken place. We're still not digital, and we're still not broadband. So how do you move to that? So what Jack and I did was we then began a series of comprehensive hearings on where we were. And what we did in the '94 law is ultimately we were saying to the cable companies, you know, you can't provide local phone service. You can't provide long distance service. So we'll let you do that if you let the long distance companies and the local telephone companies into your business providing cable service. So you have all these communications colossi, you know, who each have had monopolies, government granted, you know, over the years. And yeah, MCI and Sprint have a little bit of a nick that they put into AT&T's long distance business. They're doing okay, but it still is separate businesses, each controlled. And the AT&T of today was not the AT&T back then. That AT&T was just a long distance company. No broadband, no cable, no local phone service. Okay, so they were all separate. So what we said to them is this, because ultimately the goal was a broadband revolution. What we said was, we're going to let all of you do everything. Cable companies can be telephone companies. Telephone companies can be cable companies. Long distance companies can be cable and local. Everybody can do everything. And we want even other companies to be able to get in, because we just want Darwinian, paranoia-inducing competition. We don't know where it's going to go, but this isn't good. You know, we still have we're still living in a long distant past. We got to upgrade to digital. It's a more flexible technology, greater capacity. And so we actually got that bill passed, 423 to 5, this whole revolution in 1994. And in 1993, we got it passed. 1994, it died over in the Senate, which I'm over in the Senate now. So I can tell you that's easy to do over there, just stopping things from happening, which is what happened in 94. But a big chunk of the major concepts already passed in 1993. And could have become law then. It's known as the 1996 Telecommunications Act, but it's only because of the inability of the Senate to process complexity in 1994. And then we came back again in 95. We passed it again. The Senate again moved a little bit more slowly, but we finally had President Clinton signing it with a digital pen in the Library of Congress. He gave me the digital pen. It's on my wall. He signed the 96 Act with the digital pen. And an ink pen, which Jack and I both received. And the revolution is on. And within 4 years, $1.4 trillion of private sector money went into this whole new digital revolution, the whole new broadband revolution. And it created companies that didn't exist: Google, YouTube, eBay. The whole vocabulary that we live with today all was created in the first 4 or 5 years after we finally moved from analog to digital. We finally moved from narrowband to broadband, because now you have the capacity with this broadband deployment to manage all this information. And so we're very proud of that. And Jack and I had to partner as Democrat and Republican to ensure that we did it together. We did it as partners. We did it not allowing ideology or party differences to get in the way, because we knew this was going to be transformative, not just for our country, but for the whole planet. Because once we did it, that would become the currency of the world. And it was a great honor to partner with Jack to do that.
And Congressman Fields, I mentioned backstage that, well, you're from Texas. Senator Markey is from Massachusetts. I mentioned backstage that my mom is from Texas, my dad is from Massachusetts. They've been married 50 years and still can't communicate. So how was it that you were able to partner so well with a congressman from Massachusetts right when you arrived in Congress?
Well, first of all, didn't his accent sound a lot like a Texas accent? If I could, just a couple of personal privileges real quick. First of all, for those of you who are from the Archer program, I hope all of you get a chance. I know Eddie would agree. I hope all of you get a chance to really study Bill Archer. There's not a better institutional member in my view than Bill Archer. What a great guy! And we're fortunate to have one of your interns, David Trevino, and we're very fortunate to have him in our office. I knew he was a good guy when he told me he worked on a ranch down in South Texas, and I asked him what his best time was in roping, and he said, "I don't rope for fun, I rope for business." So, so David, we're glad to have you. Also, for those of you from NYU in the Bradamus school, I think Eddie would say the same thing. John Bradamus, what a great institutional member. And then finally, for those of you from Baylor, I went to Baylor, undergrad law school. I think it's a great school, so we're glad you're here. Now to get to your question, you know, people ask all the time, how did someone who has a different political persuasion than mine, Senator Markey, and I'm going to apologize to him in advance because I'm going to refer to him, I know, as Eddie. How did we get together, and how were we able to take a very complex series of issues and actually blend something together in what I think is one of, and this sounds very immodest, but one of the great pieces of legislation. First of all, Eddie and I are friends, and you know, we played basketball every day together. And well, we had an interesting group. Al Gore, a guy named Tommy Downey from New York. Those of you who are from NYU, very liberal Democrat. Marty Russo from Illinois. Toby Moffett from Connecticut. And then Mike Oxen. Oxen and I were the only two Republicans, but we became like a band of brothers. And so those of you who feel like bipartisanship, it can't happen, it happened with us. And what it resulted in was Eddie and I being able to confer on what I thought was a very important policy dynamic. And so what happened when we were basically, you know, passed the torch, Eddie had already set the example of working in a bipartisan manner, you know, consulting us as Republicans. So when things changed and all of a sudden the gavel was handed to me, you know, one of the first things I did was went to Eddie. 94 passed a good piece of legislation.
So 95, we had a bit of a change in power in Washington, right? No. So the Republican Revolution, the Republicans won control of both the House and the Senate. Speaker Gingrich took over the House, and you all flip-flopped seats on the committee, on the subcommittee, and
so for the first time in like 40 years, Republicans were in the majority. And all of a sudden, I had the chairmanship of not only telecommunications, which was a sixth of the economy, but our jurisdiction also extended to the securities industry. So we had all of telecommunications, we had Wall Street, and what a lot of people want to talk about is the second major reform that Eddie and I passed together, and that was the Capital Markets Improvement Act of 1996. That was the first you know, policy improvement from the 1933, 34, and 40 Act. Legislation that was passed after the Great Depression to deal with the financial industry. But the thing about Eddie and I, when we recognized that we had a historic opportunity to actually move a piece of legislation, I think we had extremely good focus. And much of that focus was because of legislation and work that had been done previously. You know, we knew where the real problems were, and Eddie alluded to this just a moment ago, and that was how did you open what was called the local loop that the local telephone companies had? How did you open that to competition by long distance, cable, and others? And we came up with what we referred to as the checklist. We created a number of things that local telephone companies had to do in opening their loop that allowed them into long distance and vice versa. And that was, I think, the biggest battle. But we also opened up opportunities within radio and television to expand. And so it really was a game changer. And what Eddie talked about was some of the results we have today. My children, you know, one of whom went to SMU, the other went to Southwestern, both studied the 1996 Telecommunications Acts in their classes. And I always said to them, you wouldn't have this today if it hadn't been for the 1996 Telecommunications Act. You would have some version of it, but in terms of what you're able to do today on your telephone, in terms of your ability to go home tonight and watch Netflix, and in terms of all your other entertainment options and your different ways of being able to communicate, I think it would be 10 or 20 years in your future if we hadn't created the dynamic that unleashed competition, which led to the massive investment in infrastructure that Senator Markey talked about, which then led to all the applications of the things that we've come to enjoy today.
If I may, just in 1993, we did another thing as well. There were two cell phone companies. They were both analog. It cost 50 cents a minute. And if you ever saw the movie Wall Street, it was like Gordon Gekko carrying around a walkie-talkie. That's where we were. So people didn't have it. So what we did was, along with Mike Oxley, is we moved over 200 megahertz of spectrum in 1993 for the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh cell phone license, while prohibiting the first two companies who were analog and 50 cents a minute for bidding for that spectrum. And the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh companies all went digital immediately. And by 1996, everybody in America, I mean everybody, had a flip phone in their pocket. They had just moved very quickly. And this was the new culture. No one had one in 93. By 96, everyone's got them.
I have to ask, I'm sorry, are you using that phone or is that a
And
demonstration model?
And then another kid, in 10 years later, he says, you know what? I think I can do this in a way in which I have a device in everyone's pocket that will be more powerful than the computer on the Apollo mission to the moon. And we'll put it in everyone's pocket. And because we moved over the spectrum, because it created all this innovation, it leads to this innovation, and 800 million people in Africa are walking around with this today, right? So you have to just break down the barriers so that you're moving digital. And so for a 12-year-old today, she thinks that she has a constitutional right to a 50-inch HD interactive screen and a wireless device that she's carrying around as well. Well, none of this existed in February of 1996.
So
you had to say, we're moving digital. We're moving to the revolution. It's all there. And I'm sorry.
So Eddie had this gigantic chip in his office. He'd walk in his office and he'd say, this is what it's all about. But are you getting a sense of how much fun he was to deal with? Probably the most fun we ever had was something that was not legislative. When I was in office, Texas A&M was in my congressional district. And for those of you familiar with A&M, during football season, the most important thing they do is Friday night yell practice. So I've never known.
What is that, Jeff?
Friday night, you were there.
Oh, no, explain to him what it is.
Who doesn't know what yell practice is? Yell practice is when Friday night you have 30 to 50,000 screaming Aggies in the football stadium before the Saturday game. I mean, it's unbelievable. There's a torchlight parade to the stadium. So anyway, I got Eddie in the parade. Eddie was the speaker. As far as I know, maybe the only non-Texan to ever address midnight yell practice. But that was the most fun we ever had.
Well, and then, so it's at midnight, just to get it. It's midnight and it's torchlight. And you march into the stadium at midnight. And there's 50,000 Aggies waiting for you. I'm not in Cambridge anymore, if you know what I mean, in Boston. Okay, I'm not. And
We have a Yankee in Texas.
They've been practicing a cheer for me. 50,000 people that Jack has set up, and I know I'm not in Harvard Square. You know, this is like a different place altogether. But it was so that we could bring a distant learning. Mickey Leland, our good friend and colleague from Houston, had died in a plane crash in Ethiopia in a hunger mission, and his wife was on the board of trustees of Texas A&M. So we created a distant learning, satellite-delivered educational system that could go into Africa, into Zimbabwe and other countries that could go into the villages. So we did that together, amongst many other things that we did during the time that we were working together, trying to use the new technologies as a way of breaking down barriers.
So we talked a little bit about the Republican Revolution of 1994. I mentioned Republicans took control of both houses of Congress. Congressman Fields, did you face pressure not to work with Senator Markey exclusively anymore?
Not at all. Eddie is not only the most fun person you'll ever meet from the House and now the Senate, he also, in terms of telecommunication policy and so many other issues, the smartest guy. Now, I say that, I may not agree with him with everything, but in terms of being intellectually ahead of most people and being passionate and caring there's not a better representative. I look at him as being one of my lifelong friends, but no, I mean, to Eddie's credit, I think when he was chairman, he set the mold that we should work together. And whereas he talked about the vote in 1993, the vote in 1995 was maybe unanimous coming out of our subcommittee, our full committee. Maybe a few voted against on the floor, and when the conference report came back, again, it was almost unanimous. And let me give you an example. Eddie wanted the B chip in the TV, which is there now, and I opposed it on the basis of, I thought that was more government regulation. A parent could get up and turn the TV off.
And that would detect the violent content.
The violence.
So the parents could make more informed decisions.
So I beat Eddie in subcommittee because I had the votes. I beat him in committee because I had the votes. He goes to the floor, gives a passionate speech along with a guy named Tom Coburn from Oklahoma, and they win. So it becomes the will of the House that the V-chip language is in the 90s, in what becomes the 96 Act. Well, we go to conference. All of a sudden, I've got the votes, along with the senators.
Because he's in the majority.
Because of the Republicans. And there's an opportunity to strip it out. Well, first of all, I'm thinking we have the will of the House, number one. Number two, Eddie's my friend. I'm not going to do that. So the V-chip stayed because not only was it the will of the House, but because Eddie was our friend. So it was that type of relationship. But we had that same relationship with people like Anna Eshoo, Democrat from California, who now chairs Health. Same relationship with Bobby Rush, chairman of Energy now, who is from Chicago. We had Eddie Towns from New York. So we actually worked as a team. And Eddie and I would sometimes talk after a basketball game, or even we'd go to each other's offices. And I would use a mythical woman named Mrs. Schultz from Belleville. It was an area of my congressional district that was primarily German. And I'd always think, what would benefit an elderly Mrs. Schultz? And I would always say to Eddie, what about a Mrs. McGillicuddy, some Irish, woman, mythical senior citizen for Boston? And I knew that was pretty serious when some reporter said, I'd like to meet Mrs. Schultz. And I'm like, she doesn't really exist. But we always tried to, among ourselves, say that telecommunication policy was not liberal, was not conservative, was not Democrat, was not Republican. That our mission was to do what was best for the American people, and creating competition, which created more opportunity, which led to more jobs, which led to all the innovation.
And because we went first, we branded it an international product made in America. So no matter where you are around the world, it's Google, it's Amazon, it's Hulu, it's YouTube, it's made in America. It's we went first, right? We took the market opportunity to go first, and then our entrepreneurs were able to raise $1.5 trillion in 5 years in order to deploy, and the rest of the world was catching up, and they're still trying to catch up all around the planet. So we were very proud to be able to have Darwinian capitalism, but then try to infuse it, which maybe I can talk a little bit about down the line, with some other values which also had to be made a part of this whole transition.
And that's really a very important point, that we became the standard. And after the act passed, I'm sure it happened to Eddie also, you'd have telecom ministers from France, from Germany, from all over the world coming to our office and say, how did you guys do it? And it was always kind of fun to say we did it because we were friends. But we also believed that we had an opportunity, that there was a moment, and we just happened to be the people at the moment in the positions of power to affect change.
And one thing we had to build into the law, by the way, is that because we now had two wires going down every street, the cable wire and the telephone wire. But the telephone companies were much wealthier than the cable companies. So there's actually a prohibition in the bill of the telephone companies buying the cable companies. If you want to get into providing video, you're going to have to deploy it yourself. You're going to have to deploy your own fiber. But you cannot buy the cable wire because you needed competition. You needed to create choice going down the street. Now, it'd be better if there were 3 wires, and RCN is in some communities the law applies for new companies to be able to get into the business and provide those additional services as well. But by keeping the prohibition in, you have an AT&T looking suspiciously over at Comcast and vice versa every single day. And it's not ideal. It would be better if there were even more companies. But that's what then accelerated the deployment, because now that they could all do everything, they all had to move very, very fast because they couldn't buy out the competition, meaning the other wire in communities all over the country.
So we talked a little bit about the very high-profile signing ceremony that accompanied the bill at the Library of Congress. Vice President Gore was there. President Clinton was there. My understanding is that at some point along the way, the Clinton White House objected to the way that the bill was trending. There was a statement of administration policy objecting to the bill as it stood. Can you talk about how you navigated that to get the bill through in a way that you knew that it was going to be signed?
Yeah. So this all goes back to the Energy and Commerce Committee. So when I was elected in 1976 to Congress, I asked the Speaker, Tip O'Neill, to put me on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which he did. Now, sitting next to me on the committee was another freshman named Al Gore. So for 8 years, Al Gore and I sat next to each other on the Telecommunications Subcommittee and on the Energy and Environment Subcommittee, meaning that we both started to work on climate change and the information superhighway back then. Just after we were running. And by the way, the senior members, they didn't care about these issues. Okay? So it was easier to make an impact when the more senior members don't even understand or care about it. They want to be on Ways and Means, they want to be on appropriations. Who would want to work on these technology issues? Right? What's the political payback for that? So, so when Al was vice president, which he was in 95 and 96 when we were considering it, and in 93 and 94 when we passed it the first time. The White House, through the vice president, they also had strong views on what should be included, and so a veto threat was always out there if it didn't conform to the most rigid competition principles. And not everyone was like Jack and I in the Congress. Remember, we were trying to get out of a monopoly era. So all that some of the members ever knew was two monopolies. And when two monopolies now are joining together to try to make sure that you're having less protections for consumers of the competition, that's a dangerous environment to be in. So it was all part of like the totality of the atmospheric, where Al had sat in the same seats on the same committee that we had served on, and he was in the White House, and he had hired one of my former telecom staffers as his chief of staff, Ron Klain. He had been my telecom staffer in 1983, 84. And they had hired Larry Irving, who had been my chief counsel, who worked for Congressman Leland, who had died in that plane crash, who was African-American, but president of his senior class at Stanford Law School. So he had been my counsel, and he hired Larry Irving to go into the White House to run the National Telecommunications Information Agency. So we had an ongoing conversation, Jack and I, about, all of the things, okay, that were going on, and I would confide with him, and he would confide with me, but it was all towards producing the strongest possible bill, and the White House was an ally in trying to make sure that it was as strong as it could be.
Let me give a consistent interpretation, but a little bit different. First of all, Eddie has always been known as having some of the best staff on Capitol Hill. He mentioned Larry Irving. Larry was African-American who worked for another African-American congressman who was one of my best friends, if not my best friend, a guy named Mickey Leland. Someone else for you to, if you have an opportunity to study Mickey. Mickey was unfortunately killed on a plane crash during a hunger relief mission in Ethiopia. But what a great guy. I delivered his eulogy in the House chamber, one of the toughest things I've ever done. Anyway, great guy. Mickey was also on the Energy and Commerce Committee. So when you start connecting some of the dots, Mickey Leland, Larry Irving, we played basketball with Al Gore. And on the Republican side, I remember going down and visiting with Vice President Gore in his office, and we talked about aspects of the bill. And his approach was a little bit different. That you know, he threw the veto threat out there if we didn't do certain things. I disagreed. I thought he would never veto something like what we were creating. And then also he had a person named Greg Simon. I don't know if you remember Greg. Greg would call me up and say, Jack, you know, the vice president has a problem with this, and we would listen. But again, coming back, there was a common thread among all of us that we had relationships and we had past history, and we all wanted the same thing. We thought the telecommunication policy had to be reformed, and so all that worked together.
When you discuss staffers, I'm going to throw out a question. This is a little bit of a curveball. Does the phrase "the wigglers" mean anything? No. I was told that some of your staff were known as the wigglers, and I'm not sure why, but.
You know what?
No.
Sometimes staff believes that the members are constitutional impediments to them doing their work to get the legislation
often,
passed.
yeah.
So that could very well be another story.
Just a comment I'd make on staff. I mean, again, Eddie has had some of the best staff in the history of Congress, but all of the people who worked on the Telecommunications Act, who were, you know, the small coterie of people that were there, I think were some of the best, the smartest that our country has to offer. I think that's why this policy has lasted as long as it has.
And Jack's staff and my staff became best friends because they had to be. They were in the bubbling, boiling cauldron of controversy and changing 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years of telecommunications law, all in, you know, one bill. And it required kind of a partnership that comes from that sense that you're part of history. That's the staff talking and working together, and that while, you know, they might come at it from different political philosophies, that telecommunications is inherently a non-ideological issue. It should be, and that's how they treated it. And so we were already friends, Jack and I, but the staffs became fast friends, and they still are to this day. They're still as close as can be.
Just one other real quick caveat. I mentioned earlier the Capital Market Improvements Act of 1996. You know, we were actually at the end of the session, and I had announced I wasn't going to run again. I had 2 small children. I was missing events. So, I mean, this was in the September timeframe before we were about to adjourn sine die, and I said, Eddie, we have a chance to do something to reform the 33, 34, and 40 Act. Eddie had some things that were very important to him. I had some things that were very important to me. We agreed that we would make sure those things happen in this capital markets bill, and then we turned to our staff, and this was without the Senate having even taken it up, that we ought to get this accomplished. And so that major bill basically occurred because of one meeting that we had, and instructed our staff to come up and was
So
very.
yeah, so this is a funny story. So, right, we're going to adjourn sine die. Sine die means in Latin without any more days. So it's all over. You have no more days. That's what it means. So this is a very controversial bill, and our staffs have, in this particular instance, have been a little bit at loggerheads in terms of what's going to be in this bill. This is a securities bill, Wall Street bill. We had the subcommittee was total jurisdiction over the Securities Exchange Commission and total jurisdiction over the Federal Communications Commission. There's never been a subcommittee like this before, or will be again, in terms of the totality of power which it had over the American Congress. Just absolutely unbelievable. So Jack came over to my office, and he said, Eddie, why don't we leave the staff outside? Which made the staff very nervous, because the members are just going to talk about this huge bill by themselves. So we compromised on everything inside of the room, and we opened the
In an hour.
in an hour, and then we said, let the staff come in, and Jack says, we've finished the whole bill. And there was like a look of horror on the staff's face that the members would actually do it all by themselves. And that bill was signed by the president. Well, I'm sorry.
No, that's really good. We're going to open up for questions real quick. Do we have, is there a microphone? Yeah. So speaking of the front here. I think you, for the recording.
Thank you for coming to speak today. What are some analogies or lessons that you've learned from your work in telecommunications that can be applied or recommended for today's tech policy? This could be in the area of technical literacy among congressmen and women, competition within the industry, public distrust or affinity for technology, and or intersection with national security issues.
And we're running a little bit low on time, so if we can address them pretty quickly so folks can get
I tell you, let me jump in right quick. This is not really an analogy. So much of what we've talked about tonight is relationship. I mean, that's not technical, but I would encourage you to understand the value of taking friends and associates and colleagues very seriously. You know, you look around this room, there are probably going to be some of you who are going to be friends forever. Eddie and I were fortuitous in that we had a love of basketball, a love of sports. We then found out we had similarities. I worked my way through college and law school selling cemetery property door to door. My family didn't have money to send me to school. And anytime you think God doesn't love you, think about selling cemetery property door to door. But Eddie sold ice cream up in Boston. So Eddie and I began to find out that we had a lot of similarities, a lot of things that were in common. And the same thing with the person I mentioned a moment ago, Mickey Levy. Mickey and I had districts that adjoined. I thought when I was first elected, I would never get along with that particular individual because of his philosophy. And one night we were sitting next to each other on an airplane coming to Washington. It was one of the late night flights, left at 11, landed at like 2 a.m. Well, during that flight, Mickey and I talked about our families. We talked about things that we had in common, children, etc., and became very good friends. And we were able to get a lot accomplished together for Texas and particularly for Houston. So that's not a direct answer to your question, but if you were to ask me to give you advice, I don't think there's any better advice than to take the people that you come in contact with seriously. I tell my daughters that.
So I would say this, that what we did back then was to take industries that were fully mature within their own sector, and we pretty much deregulated them so that they would all ultimately have to compete against each other on everything. And what it begat, and that was the solution to a problem. That is, we were still analog, we were still navigating, we were still dying. So we had to change. But that revolution creates another revolution and another set of issues. So that revolution now creates the broadband revolution. And they start off, all these companies, idealistically, they're technologists. But as the years go on, there becomes a problem because the MBA graduate has like a 3-point program to maximize profit. And so then you reach 1998 and 2018 and 2019, and you see Cambridge Analytica. You see YouTube Kids compromising, the privacy of children. So now you see a whole new set of issues that have been created by those companies that didn't exist in 1996. And to a certain extent, they can't help themselves because they can see that there's an ability to monetize people's privacy, that there's an ability to capitalize upon their ability to exploit children, for example. So, like my partnership with Jack back in 93, 94, 95, 96, I've gone to John Thune, Republican from South Dakota, and said, why don't we pass a law banning robocalls in the United States? And we're going to get that passed because there's more that can be done with one wireless device than could have been done in 1991 with the most sophisticated analog technologies. So we're going to do that. I went to Josh Hawley, who is the new Republican senator from Missouri. He was the attorney general, and he just defeated Claire McCaskill. So I went to him, and I said to him, we should provide, at a minimum, a privacy bill of rights online for every child under 16 in our country. So we're introducing that legislation. Josh Hawley and I, Republican. You have to try to find the places where you can partner in technology policy with members from the other party, that then you can isolate the pragmatic middle that'll think, oh, we really don't have to do anything. But as long as you've got a partner who agrees, then we can work it towards that point where you can get that legislation passed. So I would say that to you, that there's a whole set of new issues that never could have existed before the 96 Act, that now exist, that have not yet been dealt with.
Excellent. Do we have time for one or two more? Okay. Yes.
So both of you sort of mentioned how you had done stuff related to the V-chip in the 96 Telecommunications Act. I was just wondering how both of you in the subcommittee in general went about determining what content would be permitted on the nascent World Wide Web and what would be able to be presented on there.
Well, this didn't deal with the World Wide Web. It dealt with, just traditional television and cable. So that negotiation went on with Jack Valenti, who was the head of the Motion Picture Association, and with the broadcasters. And so even the determination of whenever you see a program start and it just says VSL and then it has a little rating next to it, that was all negotiated largely by my staff director, David Moulton, who had two girls who were like 12 and 9. And so you didn't want to be in the room with him because he was an expert on that. And so that all became something that got negotiated. And increasingly, however, the web is the place where kids are going. And unfortunately, there are too many people who are trying to exploit the web, as kids would much prefer to be there. So as their eyeballs are moving over here, we have to move over there with them. And we need much stronger lines of demarcation in terms of what kind of programming could just be directly targeted towards them, what kind of products can be targeted towards them in terms of marketing. What are the rules? You know, if you're a 13-year-old girl and you have anorexia, or bulimia, depression, and you go online to get information about it, should you be allowed to be bombarded now with all kinds of ads from companies that want to sell you products, given the fact that the mother and father haven't even told anyone else in the family about it? You know, should the family have a right to say, erase that, stop targeting my child? What are those rights? So that's where we are now, because increasingly those old rules still work for television, but we need to understand that a lot of the marketers have moved over to the internet, and YouTube Kids is a good example, but there are many other examples that we can use, where in 1998, after the act passed and Jack had moved on, I was able to pass the Child Online Privacy Protection Act of 1998, which is the constitution online for what you can do in targeting children. But that was in the BF era, in the before Facebook era. It's so 1998. So that's why you have to lift it to under 16. That's why you have to have much firmer guidelines, because we know what's going on with these companies, and everything we've learned with all these scandals in the last 2 years has helped us to understand that there has been no true internal regulation that's been going on, and that's when the government has to step in.
Hi, you said you were, when you're trying to increase competition in the 1994 and you were trying to infuse it with values. I was wondering what values you were chosen to infuse and how'd you go about doing that?
So I will give one example, and Jack can. So my cousin Mary, I live in a blue-collar community that's in the bottom 20%, bottom quartile of income in the state of Massachusetts. And the math gene in my family runs through the female side. My mother could just do calculus for fun. All the women in my family were just absolutely incredible, doing math. So at the BB Junior High School, sometime in early 1993, I went to the BB Junior High School. My cousin Mary taught math in the junior high school. She had a single computer, and like 25 kids were huddled around it. And so she was teaching math, and then when we got later on in the class, she said to the kids, "How many of you have computers at home?" And only like 4 of the 25 kids in Malden, because I'm not in Lexington, I'm not in Newton, I'm not in Brookline, I'm in Malden. Then she said, "How many of you would like to have computers at home?" And they all raised their hand. And then my cousin said to me, "This is not going to be good, Eddie, because when we were growing up, you just had to take your book bag home, and then you could compete with the superintendent's son or daughter, and you could compete with Newton and Brookline. But today, these kids are going to get left behind." So inside of the 1994 Act, Jack and I built something called the discount rate, meaning that these telecommunications companies were going to have to provide for a discounted rate to schools across the country and libraries access to the internet. And again, that died in the when the bill died in 1994. Then in the 96 Act, we built in something called the E-rate, or education rate, which is the way in which poor kids all across the country gain access to the internet. When the law passed, only 14% of classrooms in America had internet access. But because of the E-rate, which is now a $48 billion technology program that we built in, it's the first time that an educational technology program was deployed for poor kids at the same rate as for rich kids in America. First time. So whenever you see pictures in inner city schools, that's the 1996 Telecommunications Act. And my view was, if we're going to speed up the rate of change, if we're going to move from analog to digital, from narrowband to broadband, then we have to speed up the rate at which poor kids and working class kids gain access to the technology, because they're just as smart as they ever were, but without a plan, they're going to get left behind. So that's the E-rate, and that's kind of a way of thinking about it in terms of when you're taking care of the big guys, you got to take care of the little guys at the same time. You got to make sure they're part of the plan. You have to make sure there's social equity built in, that there's access to it. So I'm very proud of that. Jack and I, worked hard to make sure that would be part of the revolution. And maybe you have an example, Jack.
Yeah, I'll give you another example. Eddie Towns, African American, very liberal Democrat from New York City, came to me and said, "Jack, I need a minority set aside for minority entrepreneurs." I said, "Eddie, there's no way we can do that." I said, "If you can come up with something else," I said, "I'd certainly be glad to entertain it." By the way, Eddie was one of our basketball buddies. So I'm going to try to help Eddie Towns. So Eddie comes back and says, the money that's being deposited because of the spectrum auctions that Eddie mentioned a moment ago is being deposited in non-interest bearing accounts. I mean, figure that out. Why would you be putting money in a non-interest bearing account? And that was for the deposit to be able to participate in the spectrum auction. And he said, "Jack, why don't we move that to an interest bearing account and then use the interest for a telecommunication development fund that would be open to any small business?" And I said, "You know what, that's a brilliant idea, Eddie." So we did that. And the result of the Telecommunication Development Fund has been the investment in computers in low-income neighborhoods, the putting of internet service in libraries and senior citizens' homes, and again, low income areas. We did the same thing in a rural broadband area that otherwise did not have access to broadband. But that was all because one member came up with an alternative that made a lot of sense. And if you look in the Telecommunication Act, you'll find that one section on the Telecommunication Development Fund, and that was because of one member from New York coming up with a solution.
One last question, and we're going to wrap up.
So you guys mentioned that you use a lot of nonpartisanship when passing the original 1996 bill, since you said that the issue of telecommunication at the time wasn't really a partisan issue. Today, a lot of questions about technology deal with free speech in that regulation. So how do you still take that in the regulations today and still make them nonpartisan?
So You're right. You're right, and that's going to be a challenge as we're going forward. Net neutrality. I introduced the first net neutrality bill in 2005, and net neutrality is just another way of saying non-discrimination. If you're a smaller company, the big company can't discriminate against you. If you're a smaller voice, the big company can't discriminate against you. You've got protections. Once you pay your bill, you've got the same rights as the biggest players in the society. So I introduced that bill, and I was successful in 2018 in actually overriding the repeal in the Trump era of those rules, and I had Republican support. Senator Collins, Senator Murkowski, Senator Kennedy from Louisiana, they signed up with me. Bipartisan, we worked out, but it never moved in the House. So that debate's going to be reignited this year because it, in a lot of ways, goes to what are the protections for the smallest voices within our society. It's kind of democracy, and so I think it's a very important subject for us to have. Net neutrality is one way of looking at it, but you can look at it in other ways in which you can look at this. But I think it's a healthy debate for our country because in a lot of ways there's a Dickensian quality to the internet, to this revolution. It's the best of wires and the worst of wires simultaneously. It can enable, it can ennoble, it can degrade, it can debase. And so there is a sinister side of cyberspace that maybe didn't get enough attention paid to it. And it's time for us to start talking about that as well, instead of just all the wonderful things of interconnectivity, portability, that are all principles in the 96 Act. It's time now to have that debate about what in fact free speech means, and whose voices are heard in the 21st century, because that is the platform that's going to be used for the rest of the century.
So I kind of hate to close by this admission. But last Saturday night in Houston, I'm working out, and I see on my TV that there's a press conference on C-SPAN. So I turn it on. There's Senator Markey, and it's all about net neutrality. And again, Eddie is one of the greatest minds, one of the greatest intellects in all telecommunication. But on that one, if I was still in office, we would be disagreeing, but we wouldn't be disagreeable. I think there are two sides to the issue, and I think I'm sure you're encouraged by your professors to take any major issue and study both sides. Don't take what Senator Markey says as gospel. Don't take what I say as gospel. You should decide for yourself. I approach it a little bit differently in that I am concerned that if you get the government involved in the control of prices and utilization of the internet, is that actually going to stymie investment? The capital investment that is needed for the infrastructure, all the fiber optic, the different satellite uplinks, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, I agree with him that there should be some basic protections. I mean, we've all become accustomed to being able to have our ability to communicate and work and do all the things that we do on the internet. So somewhere there's a balance. I mean, it would actually be fun if Eddie and I were still able to work together, because I'm sure we could come up with a solution.
And we would have come up with a solution about long ago on this issue. But telecommunications policy is now much more contentious.
Is that because the issues have changed or the Congress has changed?
Well, there was a time when, in the early introduction, we heard that there were more lobbyists than the energy industry, insurance industry, all combined. Well, that's on steroids today, in terms of the amount of money that is represented in Washington, by all of these companies that are now the wealthiest in the history of the world, many whose names didn't exist in 1996, but now they have this incredible wealth. But the companies that did exist are still around too. So it's only complemented with even more people. So when Jack and I were doing it, I'll be honest with you, when Jack and I were working together, and there were other members as well, House and Senate, but we had the subcommittee that had produced the first draft, which ultimately becomes kind of a working document. We really didn't have to consult with many people. You know, we could take it all in, and most people had no idea what we were talking about. Broadband, internet, just not something that was part of the common parlance of the day. Today, everyone thinks they're an expert. I mean, just everyone. So it complicates policymaking. And the money today is so huge in this area that floods this city as well. Not towards finding a solution, but kind of creating a kind of a paralysis in terms of the ability to deal with it. So there's a part of this that Jack and I, we look back nostalgically at a simpler time, simpler to the extent to which we created the broadband revolution, you know, here and across the whole planet. But in a way, it's much more difficult today because of the amount of money that's in the system.
And also,
I'm sorry, but at the same time, Jack and I represent what has to happen, and that's what I'm trying to do with Republican members right now. Just find where are the issues where we can work together, so that we can find solutions to these problems. So there might be another way of looking at it, but that era is one that doesn't exist any longer, and there's no point in us trying to go back to it because it's not coming back. It is what we were able to do. And I'm just going to tell them one final thing, Jack, which is you keep saying basketball. There's a gym in the House of Representatives, a gym, and it's a basketball court. It's not quite a full court. It's kind of like from the top of the key to mid court. It's only 2 steps, so it's perfect for congressmen. Okay, so we're able to play, get in our cardio, and then be Democrats and Republicans playing each other right in the House of Representatives. Okay, we're able to play, and then when your endorphins are flowing right after you finish the game, you're much more likely, especially if Jack was my teammate in defeating Democrats and Republicans on the other team. So it even enhances the likelihood that you're going to be, trying to find a way to continue to be teammates. So I just wanted to explain that to you because basketball just kept coming up, but it's Leon Panetta was down there, and Dan Quayle, and Ian Al Gore, and all kinds of other people whose names you probably don't even know. But
so do y'all remember Tip O'Neill, who was a speaker? Speaker O'Neill would not call a vote between 4 and 6 o'clock every afternoon because he knew we were playing. Oh, yes, that was 4 and 6.
Because he knew you would be playing basketball, or?
He knew we were playing basketball. And a lot of times we would come running into the House chamber in suits and tennis shoes. But really, we really became a band of brothers. But I want to come back just real quickly on this question about the internet. To give you a context, when Eddie and I were working together, Eddie and I were one of the first members of Congress that actually had a computer. We actually wrote our own speeches. We were actually on the internet. I mean, this was the beginning vestige of what you have today. And I don't know that for Eddie, but for me, I never had an opportunity to meet Bill Gates until I went to Seattle. I knew about Microsoft, but I never could get anyone from Microsoft to come and talk to me. So I had to go out to Seattle. Bill Gates, a guy named Steve Ballmer, Paul Allen, who recently passed away, the big 3 of Microsoft. Went out with Jerry Slimming, one of Eddie's ex-staffers. And we walked in the room, and it's kind of like, why are you guys here? We don't exist, or we're so big and so good, we don't need you. But I felt that there was a vacuum, so to speak, of many of the people who were really looking forward and to what was going to happen. I think we were handicapped to a degree, and also at that point, you really didn't have a vibrant Silicon Valley to actually give us advice on things like the internet that they began to see, as part of the future. So I always felt like that was a deficiency in our part. But again, I want to, if that's the end, I want to close by saying you'll never meet a more entertaining guy. You'll never ever meet someone who is more intellectually stimulated. I may not agree with him, but I always know his compassion, his heart his brain, his soul is in the right place. And I was blessed to have the opportunity to work with him.
How many of you are from Texas? Now, Jack went to Baylor, but if I told you his brother was quarterback in the Baylor football team, are we talking Texas aristocracy now? That's Jack, and he is an athlete cut out of his brother's mold. So it was a
Okay,
that
so
basketball game was no.
We unfortunately,
and by the way, when I played basketball, it was 40 pounds ago. But talking about aristocracy, that night that I mentioned when Eddie spoke to the Yale practice at Texas A&M, I don't know if you remember John David Crow, Heisman player from Texas A&M. He gave Eddie a football. He didn't give me one.
all right, I'm so sorry. We do need to wrap up.
But we thank you all for what you're going to do in the future.
I'm left contemplating a story on the secret history of basketball and the 96 Telecom Act. I think that's my next story. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Thank you, Congressman Fields. Thank you, Senator Markey. Really appreciate it. Oh, we're all set. Thank you. Good night.